in Outthink the competition, my methodology is really simply 4 steps that will be relevant here.
Please.
Imagine, dissect, expand, analyze. Imagine, what's our vision for the future? What's our goal? Dissect. Given all the parts of our business model, which ones should we focus on to get there? Should we focus on sales? Should we focus on people? Should we focus on execution? Expand is, given those things that we should focus on, what are 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 different ways to get there? Analyze is, of those 150 ideas, which are the 5 that are going to get us there the fastest, the cheapest, with the greatest ease? So those are the 4 steps that then plug into those 5 boxes.
Very cool. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on what part of the world you're visiting us. Hi, my name is Daniel Marcos, the host of the Learning Out podcast. And today I'm with a really good friend and partner, thought leader at the Growth Institute, Kaihan Krippendorff. Kaihan, how are you?
I'm great. It's so great to be here with Daniel. It's been a while since I've gotten to see you.
Yes, we haven't spent time in a long time. And now I heard you just moved to Miami, or you're in Miami now.
Yes. We moved just a little over a year ago, back down from the Northeast, outside of New York.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, moving the books is always a mess when you're moving.
Yeah. Yes. I know. But it came with this beautiful full wall of books, so I could actually have most of my books up. I couldn't have that before, so it was worth it. Yeah.
We like the house. All right.
Yeah.
So let me do a quick intro and then we'll go into the conversation. Kaihan Krippendorff is the CEO of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists, innovators, and intrapreneurs shaping the future of business. He's a speaker, a thought leader. He has written several books, Outthinking the Competition, one that I'm a huge fan, and helps organizations generate breakthrough ideas. We're going to talk a lot about strategy and planning on this, but he really helps you to achieve long-term. And by the way, Kaihan, I really like that you said, how could to outthink the competition? In poker, a lot of players just play with their own hand. You play with your competitor's hand. I really like that you get it to understand the competition. And I want to talk about that. All right. So first, let's talk about, this is something that I have stuck, that I have a huge hard time with it. When I talk to companies and said, let's do the strategy, they start planning. And I was like, no, that's planning. Let's do strategy. But strategy is uncomfortable. It's difficult to explain. It takes a long time. So people don't like it. So what's the difference of planning and strategy? Great
question. Well, first of all, in my podcast, Outthinkers, I ask every guest, what's your definition of strategy? And these are all strategy experts, and I get a different answer every time. So take everything that I share as just my personal view, and I will defend it, and I'm happy to be wrong about it. But I think the difference between planning and strategy is, on one level, it's just simply strategy decides what you should plan for. So strategy comes first, and then planning is the alignment of the organization, the execution plans to execute the strategy. So if you're using any strategy methodology, like the one-page plan, for example, or something like that, there's a box that says, these are the 5 things that we're going to focus on. And you plan your resource allocation, who you're going to hire, your KPI, everything you plan against those 5 things. But what goes in those 5 things is strategy. Now, you could just write in what you want, but what I encourage you to do is come up with 100 things that could go in those 5 things, make those things compete with each other, and make sure only the best things go into the 5. The other thing I would say, another distinction I think is, fun strategy and good strategy creates unpredictable outcomes, and planning creates predictable outcomes. Predictable outcomes, our revenue will be this much, our profit margin will be this much, and are we to plan or not? But what those things could be are a result of strategy, which should be ideally to produce unpredictable outcomes that are inconsistent with what we've done before. We've been growing at 10%. Could we grow at 50%? Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Right. So how do you do strategy? Like you said, okay, you have these 5 boxes. What goes in those 5 boxes? How do you decide that?
Yeah. Well, in Outthink the Competition, my methodology is really simply like four steps that will be relevant here.
Please.
Imagine, dissect, expand, analyze. Imagine, what's our vision for the future? What's our goal?
Yep.
Dissect. Given all the parts of our business model, which ones should we focus on to get there? Should we focus on sales? Should we focus on people? Should we focus on execution? Expand is, given those things that we should focus on, what are 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 different ways to get there? Analyze is, of those 150 ideas, which are the 5 that are going to get us there the fastest, the cheapest, with the greatest ease? So those are the 4 steps that then plug into those 5 boxes.
Very cool. I love your winning moves document, your 2x2. Very simple. When you have all these ideas and people want to do everything, we have to help them choose. So tell me about that. How do you, so typically companies want to do way more, but they have capabilities. So how do you help them choose?
Yeah, it's sort of a balancing act of 3 things. One is, of the things that we're doing are if we did those things, would it get us to our goal? So we set a revenue goal or a profit goal, a market share goal. If we did these 5 things, each of those would get us so much revenue. And if we added them up, would it get us to our goal? That's number 1. Number 2 is, do we have redundancy? Because if we have, unless we're executing a strategy that we've already executed, there is uncertainty, and some things will work, some things won't work. And what you really want is, Sun Tzu said, you set multiple traps. So if your opponent, your enemy doesn't step into one, they back into another. So similarly with strategy, once some redundancy, if one doesn't work, another one will work better, right? So, but the third thing is your bandwidth and resources. Are we doing more than we can do? And the risk is not so much, in my experience, that you end up working too hard or spending too many resources. The risk is that of those 5 things, you do all of them only 70% of the way there. And the payoff doesn't really often doesn't kick in until you've gotten to 90 or 80% there, right? So you're doing these 5 things, but you only went 70%. So all you have is a bunch of foundational things that you put in place, and you've got your systems and your dashboard and everything, and you started selling, but you have not actually closed the deal. So then it looks like you failed across the board, but it's just because you didn't put enough effort and resources into the strategies.
Okay. You mentioned something about just getting it to 70%. Why just 70% and not to 100?
Well, because, I mean, if you took the pool of resources and time that you have, right, and you just try to spread it over 5 things, I don't know. I can't do the math so quickly in my head, but let's say you have 100 resources, and you have 5 things. Those 5 things would require 130 resources.
Yep.
Right now, you only fill in each of those buckets by 7 out of the 10 that you need. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. How to outthink the competition? How do you do a strategy that will go farther than your competitors? How can you make sure? We always say that most of the companies are talking very short term, and if you think long term and you do great strategy, you are going to outthink them and overcome them. How do you convince companies to think more longer term?
Okay, got it. So I think those are 2 different questions. Thinking long term is one requisite for outthinking the competition. And then there are other requisites, but it does start with thinking long term. I think Elon Musk said, I compete so far out into the future that there is no competition in the future. Yeah. And so that is an advantage, is you're playing a game that no one else is playing. So by stepping out to the future, there is no competition there, right? Like, I got to interview Elon Musk way before I graduated from him and with him in high school. I mean, in college.
You went to college with Elon Musk?
I did, but I won't say I'm not friends with him. I didn't really know him. Before he is as big as he was, I used that as a way to get an interview with him when he launched SpaceX. So I do not claim any association with him or anything. I mean, I'd love to, but I don't want to misrepresent. So I use this to get to his PR person, and then I get an interview with him. And I asked him, how come you sold PayPal? You net $150 million for yourself, and you decided to invest all of that in building rocket ships. And his whole logic was that in the future, humans will become interplanetary species. That is the future. To achieve that, we need to build down the cost to build and launch a rocket ship. To do that, the government's going to privatize its space program. And so he's positioning himself for being the company that's perfectly tailored to take that off of their hands. So he's planning out into the future. And it's not a future. So that same week or the next week, I go and I do a facilitation for a leadership team of a large company that for many years has been building rocket ships and building missiles and jet fighters. And, I shared this interview, and they laughed at him. And they're like, that is so far off. There's no point in plan. But it's like envisioning checkmate. If you're just trying to move your pawns closer to their king, and you're not thinking ahead about what checkmate would look like, you don't see the strategic move that positions you for checkmate. So what
are the other things to do to outthink your competitors? That's one long term.
So that's the first one. I'm going to map it to an idea again. Okay. So the first is, you think long term, they're thinking short term. That's the first thing. The second is is on dissect. You're focusing on different parts of the business than they are.
Okay.
They've got the mindset of product and sales, product and sales, product and sales. And many entrepreneurs, we feel like we need to get scale, right? It's product and sales, right? But in this podcast, you show, hey, it's also culture, right? It's also operations. It's also what physical experience you create, right? So I have these 9 Ps just as a checklist that's helpful. Your positioning, you can focus on that. Your product, when you have those two, you have product market fit. Your pricing strategy, and I mean basis of pricing, your placement or distribution strategy, where are the fish that you're fishing for? Then your physical experience, then your processes, then your people, and then your purpose. And when your competitors are focusing on 2, you can find ideas that they won't conceive of if you're focusing on different ones than they are. That would just naturally happen. You're thinking about process. They're thinking about culture, and they're not thinking about culture. So there's the third one. And then analyze your strategy should include some ideas that won't work or that you cannot show will work because the technology is not there, or because you don't think it's feasible. But the reason you don't think it's feasible is because you have no evidence that it will work. And I think that is a big place, right?
So you have evidence.
You have no evidence. And any new strategy you cannot have evidence for because there is no existing evidence. No one's done it before.
There is evidence. In strategy, there's no evidence.
Yes. So you have hypotheses. Well, I would say some elements of your strategy you have evidence for, right? You're going to protect your fortress. That's your current business. You know what works there. But you also need to have ships going out looking for new territory. And for those ships, they're taking a risk. They're adventurers. There's less evidence for those.
So let's talk about this to try to put some context. Southwest Airlines.
Yep.
I understand that 20% of the people in the US flew in planes, 80% moved themselves by buses. So the strategy of Southwest was, how can I convince that 80%, right?
Yep.
What kind of assumptions they did to say, hey, I'm going to convince that 80% to go into a plane? I imagine that's what they had to do, right?
Yeah. I think there are lots of interesting elements of Southwest. That makes sense. That's like the starting, that's the main point. And what they did there's a stratagem. I believe there are 36 strategies. One of them is create something out of nothing. And one application of this one is to unlock non-consumption. So you look for people who are not consuming, not just from you, not like they're going to another airline. No, that's just competing for market share. It's the person who's staying home, who's taking the bus, who's driving themselves, who's on Zoom instead of whatever that is, right? And there's usually 4 reasons. You circle that non-consumption, and there's one of 4 reasons that they're not consuming, or multiple of these 4. Number 1 is price. They can't afford it, or they don't think they can afford it. I could never afford to go on a plane. They don't know how to use it, or they feel overwhelmed. Like they don't know how to do pre-check and then check in, and I'm checking in, but I'm handing in my luggage or whatever. It's confusing for them. They don't have access to it. There is no airport near me, right? Or time. I don't have time to stop and think about looking at a plane. I'm getting on this bus because I just don't have time to think about that, right? So you can identify which of those 4 things are preventing that, creating that non-consumption. And when you identify it, then you design your strategy to remove that. Maybe it is price, right? So let's make pricing really, really simple, right? So yeah.
Right. So let's talk about 2 case studies. Give me a case study of a big company that you admired how they did the strategy, and then tell me a story of a small, mid-sized company that they did an amazing strategy, even if we don't know the company, but we will relate to it as a mid-market company.
Yep. So one company that is very admired today and has produced incredible results over the last 5 years. And they're in an HBR article that I wrote. I took these like 15 pairs of companies and looked at outperformers and underperformers. And maybe a month and a half before we are recording this, I published it, is Microsoft. Right. And Microsoft 5 years ago was fairly similar in performance to Oracle. And now they have just like left Oracle in the dust. And I've gotten to do some work in Microsoft. It's been a while, but I saw this kind of strategic shift. So it begins with a strategic shift. In Microsoft, it was shift from having a device-centric culture to having a service-centric culture. And when you're device-centric culture, what you're trying to do is you're trying to design your software to support PCs and Windows-based devices, right? When you're a service, when you say our value, that could be where our profit pools or where we distinguish ourselves or where our future is, whatever. Our value is under the services. Those services, they're digital. It's Word, it's Office, it's, OneDrive. We can now distribute those through different devices, right? And so a good strategy, a new strategy usually begins first with this deep metaphorical psychological shift. When you make that shift, then you start making decisions differently. Should we make Office available for the iPhone? If you're a device-centric culture, no, we're not going to. And actually, Steve Ballmer was not going to let that be released because it had features that were available for the iPhone-based Office product that were not available for the Windows Phone-based Office product. Satya Nadella then gets voted in and he releases it. That happened weeks after he became CEO. They didn't build that thing weeks.
It was built already.
It was built. It was ready to go. But the strategic mindset wouldn't let that. So the strategic mindset shapes the options that you see and the options you choose, right? Nice. So I think Microsoft's a good example of working on the strategic mindset and then letting people naturally pursue, right?
So they went to, it didn't care what device you were at, but they were still going to service you.
Yes.
And
which also means you start playing with companies that have a competitive overlap with you,
like Apple,
right? Like sales, and you probably wouldn't have Microsoft's involvement in ChatGPT or OpenAI if they weren't comfortable with playing with people that have competitive overlap, because they compete with them and they are investors in and take part in them as well.
Right. Now let's go to a case study of a smaller company. Probably we don't know the name, but you really admire what they did.
Yeah, I think one of my favorites is one of our coaches, because we have coaches that are trained in the idea outthinker process. And we did facilitation as part of our training. And they came in, husband and wife team. They had a company that made windows, like windows for your house, right? And they were 100, let's just call revenue of 100. And their issue was they sold windows through window retailers who would sell to contractors. So you've got to build a house. I need windows. Your contractor says what kind of windows you want. That contractor goes to a retailer. The retailer then says, we got this one, this one, this one, this one. Now, the issue was that the retailers, they wanted to make sure that they offered multiple suppliers. Yes. Because if they concentrate too much on one supplier, then they become captive. Bottlers for Coca-Cola, for example, they're captive, or distributors for Budweiser, they're captive, right? Because anyway, you understand, right? They negotiate leverages. So they said, how could we remove that? Because that's what's holding back our growth. And they came up with this idea. It was a crazy idea. Was what if we just bought the retailers? And they thought, oh, that's all right. That was a joke. Why? Because we're a small company. We can't afford to buy them. If we bought them, we wouldn't be able to run them, right? So there's no way we're going to do this. But in the outthinker process, what we encourage you to do is sit with the seemingly crazy idea. And they thought it through and came up with ways to remove the barriers. So one thing they did is they came with this idea of buy and operate, right? We're going to buy your company from you. You can cash out and you're going to stay and operate the company. So now you become an employee, but you've gotten your cash out. So now they've solved the management bandwidth problem. And then they found a banker and came up with a creative way of financing these acquisitions. So the acquisition was backed not by their company, but by a target company. And after they did 2 or 3 of those deals and the bankers started seeing the returns, they opened the floodgates. And in 5 years, they 10x'd their revenues. Yeah.
Now they went bought the retailers.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
So very similar story. You go to Mexico. Your wife works for a Univision. They have Televisa in Mexico.
Television now.
That's correct.
Yep.
Oxxo is the 7-Eleven in Mexico. 35,000, 40,000 stores. It started like that. In Mexico, we have 2 beer companies. And Corona, that's Modelo. And the other one is Cerveceria, Sol and Indio and all that. And Corona went to the retailers, Walmart and stuff, and said, hey, if you want to sell Corona, you could not sell the other breweries.
Yes.
And the retailer said, fine. So he got monopoly on the retailers. So Sol or Cerveceria said, we're going to do retailers. And they did this. Oxxo.
Oh, wow.
Oxxo becomes so big that now they sold the beer.
Wow.
Now they don't own
just
the beer.
operate
they have like 40,000.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I went to Brazil to give a keynote last year. And from the airport in Sao Paulo to my hotel, I saw like 10 Oxos.
Wow.
So I did a video. By the way, it went viral and went to the owner. So
Ooh.
I got a call from the office. That was very cool. But it's crazy that they opened 1,000 retailers in
Yeah.
Sao Paulo in the first year.
Wow. Wow.
Because now they know their business.
Wow.
They build the retailers and they build the 7-Elevens in Mexico. And now gas stations, before they were all owned by Pemex, the Mexican oil company, now you could have independent. And now they open gas stations. They have like 10,000 gas stations and like 40,000 retailers.
Amazing.
And it's an amazing, amazing business.
So do they sell beer from multiple brands? Just their beer, or do they sell other beer? Competitors' beer?
The thing is, they own, or they used to own, a brewery with like 15 different brands of beer. So they sell their own 15.
All right, so it's still enough variety.
In Mexico, we have 2 breweries that own probably 90% of the market. One owns 50, one owns 40.
Gotcha.
Each one has a collection of 15, 20 different beers.
That's
and
great.
They just sell their own or the ones that they built.
Yeah. Well, I think both of those cases are interesting in that my next book, which will be published in a couple of weeks from this recording, called Proximity. And one implication of proximity is that having access to the end customer has become very important, because technologies are going to allow people to start moving ever closer to where and when demand is. So I call this the borrowed road strategy. You want to become the borrowed road. I think that PillPack is a great example. PillPack is a company in the US created by a second-generation pharmacist, and he's working in his pharmacy, and he notices that people who have multiple prescriptions have this terrible time getting their drugs because they have to make multiple trips, leave their home, they get these bottles, they can't open them, compliance is low. He says, no, the way it should be delivered is it should be delivered to your home, not in bottles by the manufacturer, but pre-sorted in little plastic bags that say 8 a.m. on Monday you have to take with the date, and you just rip them together. So he builds this. He becomes the closest point of demand.
Nice.
Amazon sees that, and 6 years after they launch, they pay $1 billion for that company to have access to the road. Amazon does the same thing with Amazon Alexa. It is a borrowed road. So I think those are good examples. The closer you can get to the road.
Let's talk about this before we go into the learning part. Acquisitions. Today, it's like the trend. Buy a company. There's, I think, 80% of the companies in the US are owned by owners that are 65 and older. Okay. And they have no generations and no success plan. So there's a really, really big trend of, instead of building a company or starting a company, is buying a company. And there's thousands of companies for sale, and the prices are crazy low. So let's talk about acquisition. I imagine a lot of strategies include acquisitions. How do you include acquisitions on strategy? You said, hey, I want to get closer to the buyer, so I'm going to buy a chain of stores like this guy's did. Or how do you bring acquisition as part of your strategy, or how do you bring acquisition?
Now, I would not say I'm an expert in acquisition strategy, but I will say kind of like when you make that choice. I think one reason is the profit pool in an industry will shift. And so if you're not buying forward or backward, it allows you to capture more of that profit pool. So the profit pool maybe is going, the beer companies are making less money, but the retailers are starting to capture more of the pie, right? So that's one reason. I think that also channels are becoming more important. Yes. And it's becoming a greater focus. The fish are moving to other ponds, and it can be quicker. If you got a great rod and a great hook that catches fish, but there are fewer and fewer fish in your pond, it is very efficient to just buy access to the other pond because you already have the superior product. I'll tell you that with our chief strategy officers that are part of our membership group, they have a very low success rate. Companies in general have a very low success rate with integration. So that's always an underestimated cost or risk of failure when you buy something that is too close to your core, right? Which requires you to then share services and integrate, people and processes and technologies, et cetera. But I do also think there is an over tendency for people to want to build on your own. It's exciting to build on your own and to be able to say this was a spin out, this was homegrown. But if you look at the cost of a successful new product launch or business launch, you should always be looking at that and compare it to what the acquisition cost would be.
Right. Let's go to learning. I'm going to talk a little bit of learning yourself and companies. Once you bring new strategies and you guys decide to go to another direction, there's a huge change management behind that. How do you convince the team to learn new skills and do change and do all these new stuff that now it's required with the new strategy?
Yeah. First, I'd say that it's very hard to change people's, maybe to get them to learn, but to get them to want to learn is very hard. And, companies go through cycles where you start off, you're a startup, you're disruptive, you're an innovator, then you find a business model that works. And then the tendency is to want to repeat that business model.
Yes.
So you start narrowing tasks, tightly managing the tasks, narrowing roles. And so you start training people and attracting people who want to do a very narrow role. And to get people to then pop up and say, no, we should rethink our roles is very hard. We've had a few sessions like this with our strategy officers. And a very common conclusion is, I think Thomas Kuhn said this, he invented the concept of scientific revolutions. And I'm not going to say something really nice here, but he said that I'm not going to get this exactly right, but no revolution has ever come to fruition by the new guard convincing the old guard. It's always been because the old guard died off and a new generation grew up without that perspective. So I do think that we need to unfortunately also look at, replacing people. And that is why having learning as a value is so important, because that is your ticket to the future. If you have people that are willing to learn and relearn, then you can have a forever organization.
Now, just to close this, about you, how do you learn? You write a lot of books. You're a thought leader. You bring all this knowledge to the market. How do you learn? What's your model, your philosophy?
It's a Deepak Chopra quote I read, which is really great, which was something like, in order for creativity to happen, it's like a faucet. The faucet has to be open. When the faucet is open, you are putting water out, then water can come in, right? So I get to put water out. I write a blog every week. I do a podcast every week. I'm always writing a book. It's my 6th book. I'm working on 2 more books. I'm always producing content, which therefore puts me in the mindset of when we're doing a roundtable or I'm doing a podcast interview or taking a Growth Institute class, I have a reason to take it. I know I'm going to use it. It's not just interest, right? So that's one thing. I'd say the 2 other things I do is creating space to have conversation without a goal. And I think that's important in any organization. There's conversation like, should we do this? But there's another conversation, which is, we're not going to decide if we should do it, but we should be talking about it because that thing may turn into something that we do. I get to have a lot of those. I've got 3 analysts I work with. And so every day I'm having one-hour conversation with each one. What did you learn about? Right now I'm looking at efficiency of internal idea marketplaces. And we're just talking about that, right? The third thing I started doing, which I would highly recommend, is I just talk to ChatGPT a lot now. I'm in the shower and I'm like, I am thinking about this idea of idea marketplaces, and economists look at this way. What are the different ways that economists can measure the efficiency of a marketplace?
Taking a shower.
Yeah, I'm taking a shower. And then she's just talking. I have a female voice. She's just talking. Well, they do it this way. Oh, if we chose this way, how would you use that for an idea? What would be the metrics? Oh, you could do this and this. And she becomes a really great thought partner. I don't listen to her for facts and data. She really helps me think through things.
That's super cool.
It is
I need
very
to try
effective.
That.
Yes.
I really need to try that.
Yes.
That's super. All right, Kaihan, thank you very much. Always a pleasure. If someone wants to follow you, talk to you, how can they reach out to you?
Best is to go to kaihan.net, or LinkedIn. I'm also very active in LinkedIn. That's probably better, LinkedIn.
That's it. That's a social network you're most active.
Yes.
All right. That's awesome. Kaihan, thank you very much. Guys, hope you enjoy everything that I do on strategy, on scaling up. It has been a big influencer of the strategy sessions we run at Scaling Up. And it's been game changer to really help companies do strategy. So I will just end with how I started. Don't just do planning, do strategy. It's uncomfortable. It's not practical. You have to jump into the unknown. But that's what companies that really win do that. So very cool. Kaihan, thank you very much.
Thank you. No, thank you. Thanks for what you do.